Sarah did not breathe when the drum started. She pressed her back against the cold stone of the old watchtower wall and told herself she was only here to understand something. That was the word she used. Understand. As if watching from a height made her a scholar and not a woman who was afraid of what happened when wolves chose each other in firelight. The clearing below was full of people she had spent years learning not to be noticed by. Her whole pack. Every last one of them dressed in deep reds and burnt golds for the occasion, their voices rising and falling in that low, circular chant that older wolves claimed could be heard all the way to the mountains. She could hear it even up here on the ridge, even with the wind cutting sideways of the cliffs. It moved through her chest like a second heartbeat. She hated that it did that. She had brought a blanket and a small cloth bag of dried apricots because she had told herself this would be comfortable. An observation. A quiet evening on a ridge with a view. She had also brought a book she had every intention of reading between ceremonial moments, which showed how well she had understood herself. The book was still closed on the stone beside her. Her name was Sarah Calloway. She was 23 years old. She kept the pack records in an archive that smelled of old wax and river water, and she had been avoiding this ritual for 6 months with the focused discipline of someone who had practiced avoidance since childhood and gotten very good at it. She was an omega in a pack where omegas were considered gentle, agreeable, soft around the edges. Sarah was none of those things. She was careful. There was a difference, though she had long since stopped explaining it to people. The mating ritual happened every 7 years. Under the blood moon. With drums and fire and the high wolves calling out bloodlines like an auction. Every unmated female of appropriate age was meant to stand in the ceremonial circle and be considered. The word considered made something behind her sternum go hard and flat every time she heard it. She was of appropriate age. She had received the summons. She had fired it in the archive under a stack of land boundary disputes from 4 decades ago and not thought about it again. She had thought about it constantly. The ridge had seemed like a solution. High enough to see everything, far enough to be nowhere near it. The old watchtower had been abandoned for 30 years. Nobody came here anymore. The steps were half gone and the roof was open to the sky and the stone was the color of old teeth, but it had a wall she could press her back against and a ledge wide enough to sit on, and from here she could watch the clearing below and feel nothing because she was far away and uninvested and simply curious. She had been up here for 2 hours and she had eaten 3 apricots and she had not opened her book once and she had felt something almost continuously, which was not what she had planned. The fire in the clearing was enormous. 3 rings of torches set in the earth, with a central bonfire at the middle that threw orange light 40 feet up into the night air. The smoke smelled of cedar and something else, something older, something the elder wolves called the binding scent, which was a ceremonial blend of roots and dried bark that was supposed to open the senses. From up here it smelled like the inside of a very serious promise. The presenting female stood in the inner ring. Sarah could see them from above. 22 women, some she knew by name, some she only knew by the records she kept for their families. They were all dressed well. They all stood straight. Some of them looked excited. Some of them looked the way Sarah felt most of the time, which was carefully neutral in a way that cost a great deal to maintain. The Alpha King had not yet arrived. That was normal. He always came last. It was not ceremony so much as fact. He was the last piece of everything. The ritual did not begin in full until he walked through the gate. Sarah pulled her blanket tighter and told herself she was cold because of the wind. Her older sister Nina had stood in that inner ring 7 years ago. Sarah had been 16. She had not watched from a ridge. She had stood at the edge of the crowd with their mother and watched Nina walk the circle and hold her chin up and smile when the high wolf called her bloodline. Nina had looked proud. Nina had always been better at looking the way she was supposed to look. Nina had been bonded to a male named Colin Marsh by the end of the night. Colin Marsh was a mid-rank wolf from the Northern Territory with a loud laugh and very little warmth behind his eyes. Sarah had watched her sister come home the next morning and known, in the wordless way that younger sisters know things, that something had gone wrong that could not be named and so would never be fixed. She had never asked Nina about it. Nina had never offered. And the space between those two silences was where Sarah had quietly built her entire relationship with the mating ritual. She shifted on the ledge and her bag of apricots slid sideways. She grabbed it before it could fall and held it against her knee and made herself breathe slowly. Below, the drums changed rhythm. Deeper now. Slower. The kind of rhythm that made the body pay attention before the mind could decide whether it wanted to. The crowd in the clearing parted. He walked through the gate. Sarah had seen the Alpha King twice before, both times at a distance and both times in daylight, which was a different thing entirely. His name was Caden Holt. He was tall in the way that some people are tall, meaning it was the first thing you registered and then your mind had to catch up to the rest of him. He walked through the parted crowd without looking at any of them, and not in the cold way of someone ignoring people but in the settled way of someone who simply did not need external confirmation that they were exactly where they were supposed to be. The firelight hit him and he didn't flinch. Sarah told herself she was watching with the same detached interest she brought to cataloging water rights documents. She was lying, but she had always been good at believing her own lies when they were useful. The high wolf began the calling of bloodlines. The drums held steady. The presenting females lifted their chins in turn. The Alpha King stood at the center of it all and watched with the particular stillness of something that has already decided, though no one else in the clearing seemed to know it yet. Sarah watched from the ridge and understood, with a slow and sinking clarity, that she was not going to open that book tonight. She was also not going to move from this ledge. She had made it this far. She had watched without being seen. The night would end, the ritual would conclude without her, and she would climb back down the broken steps in the dark and return to her archive and her work smelling quiet and no one would ever know she had been here. That was the plan. It was a good plan. The Alpha King's head turned toward the ridge. It was not a large movement. His chin lifted a fraction. His shoulders did something she could not name from this distance but which made the air feel suddenly thinner. The drums continued. The high wolf continued calling. The presenting females continued standing in their circle. He had stopped listening to all of it. Sarah's apricots hit the stone floor of the watchtower very quietly. She did not reach for them. She was not certain she could make her hands work at this particular moment. She pressed herself against the wall as far as she could go and thought about how well hidden she was and how dark it was up here and how there was absolutely no reason for anyone to look at a crumbling abandoned watchtower on a ridge when there were 22 women in firelight 40 feet below. His gaze settled on the ridge with the unhurried certainty of something that did not need to search because it already knew. Sarah stopped breathing entirely. The drums played on. The cedar smoke rose. The blood moon climbed higher over the clearing, and the Alpha King stood in the middle of a ritual that had paused inside him, and Sarah Calloway pressed herself against cold stone on a ridge above it all and understood that the plan had developed a serious problem. She was not hidden enough. She was not sure anywhere was hidden enough. She stayed completely still and told herself this meant nothing. She told herself he could not possibly know she was there. She told herself a lot of things in rapid succession, the way a person does when they are building a wall out of words fast enough to keep a flood back. The wall held for approximately 4 more seconds. Then the Alpha King raised his hand. The drum stopped. The chanting stopped. The whole clearing went silent the way only a wolf pack can go silent, all at once, without gradation, like a sound that had simply been switched off. He did not speak. He did not look away from the ridge. Sarah's blanket was still around her shoulders. Her book was still closed. Her apricots were on the floor. The wind moved her hair across her face and she did not push it back because that would require movement and movement was not an option she was currently allowing herself. Then his voice came up the hillside, low and even, carrying the way voices carry when they do not need to be raised to reach you. Calm down. 2 words. She felt them in her back teeth. Her legs stood up before she had finished deciding anything. She walked down the broken steps of the watchtower in the dark with her blanket still around her shoulders and her book tucked under her arm and absolutely no explanation for what her legs were doing. The steps she had climbed carefully 2 hours ago seemed steeper now. One of them was missing entirely and she found it with her foot instead of her eyes and grabbed the wall and kept going because stopping did not seem like something she was capable of at this particular moment. The path from the ridge to the clearing was narrow and overgrown and she had to push through 2 curtains of hanging branches that left damp lines across her sleeves. She did not remember noticing the branches on the way up. She had been more purposeful on the way up. She had been a woman with a plan on the way up. She came out of the tree line at the edge of the clearing and 700 wolves turned to look at her. She had been stared at before. Everyone had been stared at. But there was a difference between the ordinary weight of other people's attention and this, which felt like standing in a spotlight that someone had aimed with intent. She stopped at the tree line and took in the fire and the crowd and the 22 women in the inner circle and the high wolf with his mouth slightly open and the whole vast machinery of a ritual that had halted in a way it had apparently never halted before, all of it aimed in her direction. She was holding dried apricots. She looked down at the cloth bag in her hand. She had picked it up from the floor of the watchtower on her way out without thinking. Her book was under her other arm. Her blanket was still around her shoulders. She looked exactly like a woman who had been sitting on a ridge minding her own business and had been summoned mid-snack. Caden Holt stood at the center of the clearing. He had not moved. His hand was still raised. As she stepped fully into the firelight, he lowered it, slowly, and the drums that had been silent started again, though quieter now, as if they too were waiting to see what came next. He looked at her. Not the way the crowd looked at her, which was with curiosity and visible confusion and in several cases poorly concealed delight at the disruption of a solemn occasion. He looked at her the way a navigator looks at the one fixed point in a storm. Like she was something he had been orienting toward without knowing it, and the finding was not a surprise but a confirmation. She had never been looked at that way in her life. She felt it go all the way through her and she did not like how much she felt it, and she decided on the spot that she also did not like him, which was not rational but was all she had to work with. She crossed the clearing with her chin level and her pace steady, and she stopped 6 feet from him because 6 feet felt like the distance at which she could still make decisions without her nervous system overriding them. The high wolf made a sound beside her that might have been a protest and might have been a word, and she did not look at him. Caden Holt was taller up close. She had known he would be, and it still registered somewhere in her chest as new information. He was dressed in dark clothing with no ceremonial ornamentation, which was unusual for the ritual, which meant it was a choice. His eyes were a dark amber that the firelight picked up in a way that made them look almost lit from inside. She noted this and then actively chose not to dwell on it. "You were watching from the ridge," he said. "I was observing," she said. "For 2 hours. I lost track of time." It was not true. She had known exactly what time it was at every moment. She kept precise track of time even on her best days, and tonight had not been her best day. Something moved across his face that was not quite a smile but was related to one. "What were you observing?" "The ceremony," she said. "I keep records for the park. I was noting aspects of the ritual for the archive." "With apricots." She looked down at the bag still in her hand. "I was going to be there for a while." The crowd had gone entirely still. Even the children, who never went still at anything, were frozen in that attentive way of small creatures who understand that something unusual is happening even if they cannot name it. The high wolf had recovered enough to clear his throat. The 22 presenting females in the inner circle were still standing in their positions, and Sarah was acutely aware that she was not in a ceremonial dress and she had branches in her hair and she was holding dried fruit. "What is your name?" the high wolf said. He said it with the strained patience of a man who had performed this ritual 6 times before and never once had to pause it to address a woman descending from an abandoned watchtower with a book. "Sarah Calloway," she said. "Park Records Keeper. Archive Division. Are you of mating age?" "That is a somewhat personal question." "It is a ceremonial question," he said tightly. "I am 23, she said, because arguing with the high wolf in front of the entire pack in the middle of the mating ritual was not something she had planned to do tonight, and she was trying to at least limit the scope of the disaster. The high wolf turned to Caden Holt with the look of a man who was very committed to the correct procedure and was currently watching the correct procedure walk away from him across a field. My lord, the ritual requires that you select from among the presented females. This woman was not presented. Caelum did not look at the high wolf. No, he said. She was not. Then by the law of the seventh right, she cannot be considered in this ceremony. She is being considered, he said. Still not looking at the high wolf. Looking at Sarah. By me. Now. Sarah said, before she could stop herself, I didn't agree to that. The crowd inhaled as one. Caelum looked at her with an expression that had moved past the almost smile into something more genuine, which was more alarming. No, he said. You didn't. So, he said. They stood in the firelight with 700 people watching and the drums very quietly continuing and the high wolf visibly reconsidering his career choices, and Sarah understood with the terrible clarity of the extremely logical that she was in a situation that none of her plans had included a contingency for. She made herself breathe. She made herself think. She was a records keeper. She understood systems. She understood rules and their limits and the precise point at which documented law either held or bent. She knew the seventh right. She had catalogued it. She had cross-referenced it against the original manuscripts twice when a dispute had arisen over the previous ceremony. You cannot bind anyone to a decision made in a single night under ceremony, she said, keeping her voice even. The seventh right requires a minimum of 3 days between recognition and formal bonding. That is in the original documents. Volume 4, Section 9, page 31. The high wolf blinked. Caelum said nothing. He was watching her the way someone watches a thing they find genuinely interesting, which made her feel simultaneously seen and unsettled, and she decided she was going to file both those feelings into the same drawer. She kept everything else that she did not have time to sort through right now. I am not disputing anything tonight, she said. I am going home. Whatever this is can be addressed through the appropriate channels during the standard review period. She turned around. She walked back toward the tree line. She had crossed perhaps half the clearing when she became aware that the crowd had parted for her without her asking, which meant they were watching her go, and she was very visible and the blanket around her shoulders was doing absolutely nothing for her dignity, but she kept walking because stopping now would be worse. She made it back through the tree line. She climbed the broken path. She did not turn around once. She sat in her room that night and looked at the wall and did not sleep. She told herself that the Alpha King would understand. He was a reasonable man. He had a pack to run, and a ceremony to complete, and 22 women who had actually showed up properly and stood in the circle and done what was expected of them. He would choose one of them. She would return to her archive. None of this would be mentioned in the official records because she was the one who kept the official records. She was at her desk in the archive by 8 the next morning. She had the correspondence from the Western Territory spread in front of her. She had tea. She had a plan to be excessively productive and methodical and to demonstrate to herself through the volume of completed work that nothing unusual had happened. The archive door opened at 9:30. She did not look up. She had a policy of not looking up when the door opened. It kept walking interruptions brief. The boundary records from the Eastern Ridge, said a voice she recognized immediately and had been hoping very much not to hear indoors. Are they organized by year or by territory? Sarah looked up. Caelum was standing inside her archive. He was not in ceremonial clothes. He was wearing ordinary clothing, dark and well-fitted, and he looked at her the same way he had looked at her the night before, which was with that complete, uninterested in pretending quality that she found deeply inconvenient. She put her pen down very carefully. By territory, she said. Then subdivided by year within each territory section. Good, he said. He walked to the shelving unit along the east wall. He found the Eastern Ridge section without asking. He pulled a folder and sat down at the reading table across the room and opened it. He did not say anything else. He stayed for 3 hours. She worked. He read. The archive was quiet in the way that archives are quiet, which is a layered quiet, full of the small sounds of paper and breathing and the particular quality of two people pretending they are not in the same room. He came back the next day. And the day after that. Always to review documents. Always to a different section. Always staying long enough that his presence stopped being surprising and started being the kind of thing her body registered before she had the door, which was something she noticed and immediately tried not to think about. On the fourth day, she asked him to stop. "You completed the ritual without me," she said, without looking up from her work. The records show that the ceremony concluded. "I saw the closing fire from my window." "The ceremony concluded without a selection," he said. She looked up. "That has never happened before." "No," he said. "The High Wolf must be furious." "He is managing," he said, in a way that suggested the High Wolf's management of the situation was not his primary concern. Sarah set down her pen again. She had been setting down pens a great deal in the last 4 days, which was itself a data point about how much this had disrupted her concentration. "What exactly do you want?" she said. Directly. Because she was very tired of dancing around the center of things. He looked at her across the reading table with that steady, unhurried attention. "You," he said. "The same thing I wanted 4 nights ago on the ridge." "You don't know me," she said. "No," he said. "I would like to." She breathed in. She breathed out. She thought about Nina coming home in the morning with her chin still up and her eyes already somewhere far away. She thought about the word considered and what it meant and who got to do the considering. She thought about how she had built her quiet life with great care and how the archive smelled exactly the way she needed it to smell and how she had been a very successful ghost for 6 years. "I need time," she said. "I know," he said. He went back to his documents. She went back to her work. Outside, the autumn light moved through the archive windows in long, slow bars, and the day passed in the particular careful silence of 2 people circling something neither of them was entirely ready to name, and she told herself that this was temporary and that she was not already used to the sound of him turning pages. She was lying again. She was getting worse at it. The pack talked. She had expected that. She had not expected the particular texture of how they talked. It was not unkind, which was almost worse. Unkindness she could have fired away. What she got instead was something warmer and more complicated, a kind of collective curiosity aimed at her like sunlight through a lens, concentrated in a way that was impossible to ignore without being possible to object to either. People she had exchanged perhaps 40 words with in 6 years suddenly had reasons to visit the archive. The woman from the Weaving Collective who had never once asked for historical records found herself deeply interested in the textile records of 3 decades ago. 2 of the younger wolves from the patrol division came in asking for maps they had never needed before and left them mostly unread on the table. A girl from the healer's house sat in the corner for an entire afternoon and pretended to read a plant catalog upside down. Sarah did not ask any of them to leave. They were, technically, using the archive for its intended purpose. She simply continued her work and pretended not to notice that the intended purpose had become watching her, which required a level of practiced invisibility she had been refining for years. She was good at this. She was better at this than almost anything. She was also increasingly aware that it was not working the way it used to. The problem was Caden Holt. Not his presence, exactly, though that was part of it. The problem was what his presence had done to the way people saw her. 6 years of careful unremarkability, and then 1 night on a ridge and 6 minutes in a firelit clearing and suddenly she was the woman the Alpha King had stopped a 700-year ritual for. That was not a story that went away. That was not something she could file under border disputes and forget. He came to the archive every day. Usually in the morning, sometimes in the afternoon, always for a documented reason involving legitimate records request. He never stayed so long that she could call it intrusive and never so briefly that she could pretend his visits were routine administrative business. He occupied the reading table with the same unhurried certainty he seemed to bring to everything, and he worked quietly, and sometimes he asked questions about the archive's organizational system with what appeared to be genuine interest, and she answered them because they were reasonable questions and she was a records keeper and this was her domain. What she had not anticipated was that he was good at silence. Most people filled silence. They talked into it or fidgeted through it or let it make them uncomfortable in ways that required managing. He did not. He sat across the room and read documents and turned pages, and the silence between them was not empty. It had weight and texture. It had the quality of something that was being built rather than avoided. She noticed this on the 8th day and wrote 3 wrong figures in the land survey she was cataloging and had to start the page over. On the 11th day, she found the folder. She had been reorganizing the mating records from 7 years ago for a separate administrative request, pulling the documents to cross-reference dates for the official boundary review. Nina's file was near the bottom of the stack. She knew it would be there. She had filed it herself 6 years ago and had not looked at it since. The handwriting on the tab was her own from when she was 17, tidy and slightly too careful, the way young handwriting is when the person is trying to demonstrate competence. She set it aside. She did not open it. She went back to the land survey. Caden Holt arrived at his usual time, late morning. He came through the door the way he always came through the door, not announcing himself, not apologizing for his presence, simply arriving the way weather arrives, as a fact. He crossed to the east wall and then stopped. He had seen the stack of mating records on her secondary desk. He had seen the folder set apart from the rest. He did not look at her. He walked to the reading table, but instead of pulling his usual documents from the eastern section, he sat down and did not reach for anything. He looked at the table surface for a moment. Then he said, quietly, "You don't have to tell me anything." She had not realized she was tense until he said it, and something in her shoulders came down a fraction. "I know," she said. "But if you want to," he said, "I'm not going anywhere." She looked at the folder. She thought about Nina. She thought about Colin Marsh's laugh and his eyes and the morning after and the 43 words they had never said to each other, her and her sister, standing in the space between the thing that happened and the ability to name it. She thought about every reason she had built the life she had built, the archive and the quiet and the careful distance and the watchtower on the ridge. "My sister stood in the inner circle 7 years ago," she said. He said nothing. He was very good at receiving things without filling them in. "She was bonded by the end of the night," Sarah said. To someone the ceremony indicated. Not someone she had chosen. Someone who was chosen for her by the crowd and the drums and the blood moon and the high wolf calling bloodlines. She paused. She came home the next morning and she has not looked the way she used to look since. The archive was very quiet. "The ritual is meant to be a connection," she said. "That is what the old documents say. A recognition of something already present. Not an assignment." She looked at him directly. "What happened on the ridge? What you sensed? I need to know if that is what it was, or if I am a coincidence of wind direction." It was the most honest question she had ever asked anyone in her adult life. Her voice did not shake, which cost her something. Caden Holt met her eyes. He had the quality, in these moments, of someone who would not look away to make something easier. "It was not the wind," he said. "How do you know?" "Because I have been at that ceremony before," he said. 4 of them, over the years. I have been at the center of the circle with the binding scent and the drums and the firelight, and I have waited for what the ritual promises, and I have walked away from all 4 of them without it. Because you can construct every condition for recognition, but you cannot make recognition happen. It either arrives or it does not. And on the ridge, she said. It arrived, he said. Simply. Without decoration. She sat with that for a moment. The afternoon light came through the archive windows and lay across the reading table in long strips. Dust moved in the light the way it always moved in here, in slow circles, unbothered. "I am still afraid," she said. "I know. Knowing that you sense something does not fix that." "No," he said. "It doesn't. Most people in your position," she said, "would have said something more reassuring just now." "Most people in my position are not talking to you," he said. There was something in it that was almost dry. Almost gentle. She filed that away somewhere she was going to have to deal with eventually. She picked up the folder with Nina's name on it. She held it for a moment, feeling the thin cardstock under her fingers, the precise edges of it. Then she put it back in the reorganized stack and wrote a note of its contents in the log and moved on to the next document, because that was how you moved through things that had no other door. You cataloged them. You kept going. He stayed until the archive closed. He did not say anything more about what she had told him. He did not treat her with the particular soft caution that people sometimes used after being told difficult things, the careful handling that always felt like being held at arm's length in the name of care. He simply continued reviewing his document and she continued her work, and when the late light started to go orange and thin, he stood and put his documents back in their correct places, which she had never once had to ask him to do. "Tomorrow," he said, at the door. It was not a question. It was not quite a statement. It was something in between. An intention left open. "Tomorrow," she said. He left. She sat for a moment in the quiet he left behind, which was different from the quiet before he arrived. She had been trying for 2 weeks to figure out why it was different, and the answer was becoming difficult to avoid. The quiet before he arrived had been hers alone, which was the kind of quiet you could hide in. The quiet after he left had someone's shape in it. She did not like what that implied about how much she had already let him in without noticing. She locked the archive and walked home through the park grounds in the early evening, through the smell of cook fires and dried grass, past the children running in the lane and the elders talking outside the meeting hall and all the ordinary machinery of a park at dusk. People nodded at her. Some of them said her name. One of the older women from the weaving collective touched her arm as she passed and said, "Only, he is a good man, Sarah," and moved on before Sarah could formulate a response. She had known this was going to get complicated. She had known from the moment she decided to watch from the ridge instead of simply staying home. She had built her life on a very precise principle, which was that the only clean way to avoid getting hurt was to not be somewhere that hurt could find you. The archive was that place. The watchtower had seemed like a safe extension of it. She had been wrong about the watchtower. She was starting to wonder if she had been wrong about the principle. Nina came to see her that night. She arrived at Sarah's door after dinner with a covered dish of something that smelled of rosemary and a look on her face that was not quite the look Sarah was used to seeing on her, not the fixed-ahead look, not the carefully ordinary expression. Something more uncertain. More like the sister she had been before the ritual, the one who had borrowed Sarah's things without asking and laughed too loudly at her own jokes. They sat at the kitchen table. Nina served the dish without being asked. They ate for a while without talking, which was the language they had always spoken most fluently. "Mother says he comes to the archive every day," Nina said finally. "He does," Sarah said. "What is he like?" Nina said. Not quite a question. More like a door left slightly open. Sarah thought about it. She thought about the silence with texture and the documents replaced in their correct places and the way he had said it was not the wind without flinching. "Honest," she said. Quietly. Nina turned her fork over in her hand. "Calling was decided by the drum pattern," she said. "Third beat on the third pass." The high wolf said that was the sign. She set the fork down. "I didn't know him at all. I still don't, not really. 7 years and I still don't know the inside of his thinking." Sarah looked at her sister. "I'm not saying don't be careful," Nina said. "I'm saying being careful and being gone are two different things. I spent so long being gone that I forgot they were separate." She looked up. Her eyes were the same dark brown they had always been. She still looked like herself, underneath everything. "You've been gone for 6 years, Sarah. I've watched it. The archive and the ridge and the way you make yourself so small that people forget to look for you." "That was the point," Sarah said. "I know," Nina said. "I taught you that. I came home that morning and you were watching me and I never said a word to correct what you learned from it." She paused. "That was wrong of me." The kitchen was very still. Outside, the park grounds had gone quiet with full dark, just the low talk of the evening patrol changing shift. "He found me on a ridge in the dark," Sarah said slowly, eating apricots and holding a book I hadn't opened. "And?" Nina said. "And he came back to the archive the next day and cross-referenced Eastern Boundary records for 3 hours. Nina was quiet for a moment. Then she laughed. It was the laugh Sarah remembered, the too loud one, unguarded. That is either very romantic, she said, or very unusual. It might be both, Sarah said, and then put her hand over her mouth because she had not meant to say that. Nina's expression settled into something soft. Something old and familiar. Go carefully, she said. But go. Sarah looked at the table. She looked at her own hands. She thought about tomorrow, which was a word that had changed shape in the last 2 weeks, from a word she used to mean more of the same into a word that had something new and difficult in it. I'm trying, she said. I know, Nina said. You always do. They finished the dish. They washed the plate side by side without talking, and it was not the silent language of things unsaid but the quiet language of things that had finally been said and could now rest. Sarah dried the last plate and set it in its place, and Nina pulled her coat on and left into the night, and Sarah stood at her kitchen window and looked out at the dark and thought about the shape of the quiet that was hers alone, and the shape of the quiet that had someone in it, and the distance between them, and whether she was ready to cross it. She did not answer herself that night. But she did not look away from the question either. That was new. The challenge arrived on the 19th day, which was a Monday, which seemed to Sarah like an unnecessarily bureaucratic day for everything to come apart. She heard about it first from the patrol chief's assistant, a young wolf named Edmund who stopped by the archive mid-morning looking apologetic in the way people look when they are bringing news they did not cause but feel somehow responsible for. He told her that 3 members of the Council of Rank had filed a formal dispute with the 7th right ruling. He told her the challenge was based on the original law. He told her the hearing was in 4 days. She thanked him. She waited until he left. Then she sat very still at her desk for approximately 90 seconds and thought about all the ways this could unfold and how many of them ended with her returning to the quiet and the wax smell and the invisible life she had built, and how many of them ended with something else. Then she pulled out the archive volumes and started reading. She already knew the law. She had cross-referenced it twice since the night of the ritual, which she would not have done if she were not still thinking about it, which was itself a data point she was trying not to calculate. But knowing the law as a reader was different from knowing it as someone for whom the law had consequences. She read it differently now. With the edge of someone looking for a gap or a foothold or a reason to believe that the thing she had not yet decided whether she wanted was still possible. The 7th right was old. The language was dense and formal and written by people who had been dead for centuries and who had never imagined a woman hiding on a ridge with dried apricots in a situation like this. The core of the challenge was simple. The law required that a female presented for bonding must be formally registered and standing in the ceremonial circle at the time of recognition. Sarah had not been registered. Sarah had not been standing in the circle. Sarah had been 30 feet above the clearing, pressed against a stone wall, technically hiding. The 3 councilmen challenging the recognition were not wrong about the law. That was the uncomfortable part. They were citing it correctly. She had verified that herself. What they were citing incompletely was the clause in section 14 of the same volume, which addressed situations where recognition occurred outside the formal ceremony. It had never been invoked. It had been written for an entirely theoretical situation that none of the law's original authors had apparently expected to actually occur. It was buried at the end of a chapter most reviewers skimmed because nothing in it had ever been relevant. Until now. She took notes. She organized the relevant passages. She built the argument the way she built every archival analysis, starting from the documented facts and working outward. By the time Caden Holt arrived at his usual hour, she had 3 sheets of notes and a headache she was choosing to interpret as productive. He came through the door, stopped, looked at the volume spread across her desk and the notes beside it, and understood immediately what she was doing. Edmund came this morning, she said, without preamble. I know, he said. I should have told you before he did. I'm sorry. She had not expected an apology. She looked at him directly. He met it without shifting. It was my decision to hold the selection open after the night of the ceremony, he said. The challenge is a consequence of that decision. You should have heard it from me. She set her pen down. How serious is it? It depends on how the council reads the historical precedent, he said. He walked to the reading table and sat across from her, not at the far end the way he usually did but closer, in the way of someone who was not positioning this as a casual visit. The three challenging members are politically careful men. They are not doing this because they believe I made the wrong decision. They are doing this because they believe it is their role to make certain the law is followed, and because they are not entirely wrong that the law is ambiguous here. It is not ambiguous, Sarah said. It is incomplete. She turned the volume toward him and put her finger on the section she had found. Section 14. Recognition outside the ceremonial boundary. He read it. She watched him read it, which she did not usually let herself do because watching him do ordinary things was becoming a problem she had not fully resolved. You found this today, he said. I found it a week ago, she said. I had not decided yet whether to use it. He looked up. What made you decide? She thought about Nina at the kitchen table. She thought about go carefully but go. She thought about the shape of a quiet that has someone in it versus the shape of a quiet that is only yours. I am tired of filing things away, she said. Something in his face did something she did not have a word for. It was not the almost smile. It was more internal than that. The hearing was in 4 days. They spent the afternoon going through the law together, she with her notes and he with the knowledge of how the council worked and the particular pressure points of each of the three men making the challenge. The councilman named Arthur Bell was the most committed to procedural exactness. The one named Gregory Hale was the most persuadable if the historical argument was made clearly. The third, a man named Philip Croft, was the most concerned with public opinion, which meant he would follow the direction the room went if it went strongly enough in one direction. She had never had a conversation like this. Not with anyone. The systematic dissection of a problem, back and forth, each of them pulling at a different thread and seeing where it led and reporting back. She had always done this alone, in her head, in the silence of the archive. Doing it out loud with another person who was equally committed to following the logic wherever it went was strange and satisfying in a way that she could not easily categorize. At one point she said something about the historical precedent that was not quite right, and he told her plainly that it was not quite right and why, and she corrected her notes, and neither of them made a performance of the correction. That, she thought, was the detail she would remember. 2 days before the hearing, Nina came again. This time without food, which meant she was there to talk, not to eat something. The park is talking about the challenge, Nina said. The park has been talking since the night of the ritual, Sarah said. About you specifically now, Nina said. She sat down at the kitchen table and put her hands flat on the surface. Some of them think you should withdraw. To make it simpler. To avoid the council fight. She met Sarah's eyes. Some of them think you want to withdraw. Do you think that? Sarah said. Nina was quiet for a moment. 3 weeks ago I would have said yes, she said. I would have said you were looking for a reason to go back to the archive and close the door. And now? Now, Nina said, I think you're reading case law at midnight and you have ink on your left hand and you've reorganized your notes twice since I sat down. She paused. That does not look like a woman looking for an exit. Sarah looked at her left hand. The ink was from that afternoon. She had not noticed. I am afraid, she said. I know, Nina said. But I am more afraid of the alternative, Sarah said slowly, as if she were hearing herself say it for the first time, which in some ways she was. I am more afraid of going back to the way things were than I am of what happens if I stay. The kitchen was quiet. Outside the window the park grounds were silver with autumn moonlight. I need you to do something for me, Sarah said. Anything, Nina said. And she meant it. Sarah could hear that she meant it. Tell me what you would have needed, 7 years ago, Sarah said. Tell me what you would have wanted someone to fight for. Nina looked at the table for a long time. When she looked up her eyes were bright but steady. I would have wanted someone to stand in the room and say my name like it mattered, she said. Not like it was a file or a bloodline or a match. Like it was mine. Sarah nodded. She went to the archive the next morning and pulled every relevant document she needed. She organized them by relevance. She wrote her argument. She checked it 3 times and found one error and corrected it and checked it a 4th time. She worked through the afternoon and into the evening with the particular focused stillness that had always been her best thing, the ability to sit inside a difficult problem until it showed her its edges. Caden Holt arrived at the archive at 4 in the afternoon and she gave him the argument she had built and watched him read it with the same focused attention he brought to everything. When he finished, he looked up. "This is good," he said. "I know," she said, because she had stopped pretending to be modest about things she was genuinely good at. It was one of the smaller revolutions of the last 19 days. "The Section 14 argument is the center of it," he said. "If the Council accepts it as applicable, the challenge fails on its own terms. And if they don't," she said, "then we need Bell, which we probably cannot get, or Hale, which we can, and then Croft follows." "Yes," he said. They sat across the archive from each other with the documents between them and the case fully built and the day running out of light. "I will stand with you in the council chamber," he said. "I know you will," she said. "I am going to ask you not to." He was quiet. "I need to do this part on my own," she said. "I need them to see me and hear me without you beside me, because if they only see you they will make the decision based on you and I need them to make it based on the law. And because," she paused, "I am not doing this for you, exactly. I am doing it for me. I am doing it because I have been invisible for 6 years and it is time to stop." He did not argue. He did not make a sound for a moment. "All right," he said. "All right," she said. He left when the light went fully. She sat in the archive alone for another hour, not reading, not walking. Just sitting in the quiet that was hers, feeling the shape of it, and the shape of the thing she was walking toward, and deciding that the distance between them was crossable. She had been afraid for a long time. Fear had been her compass, her map, her reason for staying in certain rooms and out of others. It had served her. It had also kept her in a watchtower for 6 years, eating apricots and watching other people's fires. She stood up. She put the documents in order. She turned off the lamp. Tomorrow was the hearing. She walked home in the dark and she was afraid and she went anyway, which was, she thought, probably what courage had always been and she had simply not been ready to find out until now. The council chamber was older than most buildings in the park grounds and it showed it. The walls were stone. The ceiling was high and crossed with dark beams and the light came from oil lamps set in iron brackets along the walls, which had always struck Sarah as a very deliberate choice, a room that ran on old light for old reasons. She had been inside it twice before, both times delivering documents that were required for formal proceedings, both times stepping in and out quickly enough that the room had not had time to feel like anything in particular. It felt like something now. She arrived before the council members. She had planned to arrive before the council members. She needed to be standing in the room before anyone else arrived, not walking in after, not following anyone's entrance, not secondary to any part of this morning's proceedings. She set her documents on the respondent's table and stood behind her chair and breathed carefully and looked at the room. The council table was a long dark wood structure at the far end. 3 chairs behind it for the challenging members. Arthur Bell, Gregory Hale, Philip Croft. The High Wolf would preside. There was a chair for Caden Holt, which was standard in any formal challenge involving the Alpha. He would be in the room. She had asked him not to stand with her. She had not asked him not to be present. She was, she thought, becoming more sophisticated about the things she was willing to ask for. People arrived. Arthur Bell was first, a trim older man with close-cut gray hair and the expression of someone who had spent 50 years being right about procedural matters and considered this one of his better days. He looked at Sarah at the respondent's table and his expression shifted very slightly, as if she had surprised him by being there early, by being there at all as a prepared person rather than an outlier who would collapse under formal questioning. Gregory Hale came in with a folder already open, reading as he walked. He was younger than Bell, heavier, with a careful mouth and eyes that moved quickly across a room and catalogued what they found. He looked at Sarah once and then at her documents and then back at his own notes. Philip Croft arrived with 2 younger advisors and the look of a man attending something he had not fully decided his position on yet, which was exactly what Sarah had expected and what she was planning to use. The High Wolf entered last. He had the same strained patience she had observed in the clearing, amplified now by the formal setting. He arranged his papers, acknowledged the room with a nod, and opened the proceeding with the formal language of the 7th right challenge process. Date, parties present, nature of the challenge. His voice was even. He was good at the official parts, she would give him that. The challenge is as follows, he said, reading from the document. That the recognition claimed by the Alpha King Cadenhold during the mating ritual of this year was not lawfully executed, as the female in question was not registered nor formally presented in the ceremonial cycle as required by the 7th right. The claim is that no bonding process may legally proceed from an informal recognition outside the ceremonial structure. He looked up. Sarah Calloway, as the female named in this challenge, do you wish to respond? I do, she said. She did not sit down. Standing at a table was different from sitting at one. She had decided this at 4 in the morning when she had stopped pretending to sleep and started thinking about the geometry of the room. The challenge cites the 7th right correctly, she said. The law does require formal registration and ceremonial presence for a standard recognition. The challengers are not wrong about that section of the law. What they have not addressed is that the law does not end at that section. She opened her document to the first marked passage. She did not read it aloud immediately. She looked at the counsel first, at each of the 3 faces in turn. Volume 4 of the Park Law Compendium. Section 14. This section addresses recognition events that occur outside the ceremonial structure and outside the standard 7-year cycle. It was written into the law because the original architect of the 7th right understood that recognition, by its nature, cannot be scheduled. It either happens or it doesn't. The ceremony provides a setting for recognition to occur. It does not limit where recognition may occur. She read the section aloud. Clearly, at pace, without rushing. She had practiced the reading enough times that it came out level. Arthur Bell's expression did not change. He had clearly read the section. She had expected that. Gregory Hale made a note. Philip Croft's advisors leaned close to him and one of them said something she could not hear. The argument, Bell said, when she finished, is that Section 14 was intended for exceptional historical circumstances. Not for a situation where the female in question deliberately absented herself from the ceremony. The law does not require intent on the part of the female, Sarah said. Section 14 specifies only that recognition must be genuine and verifiable. The Alpha's testimony establishes that it was genuine. The stopping of the ritual by 700 witnesses establishes that it was verifiable. She paused. The law was not written to protect a technicality about where I was standing. It was written to protect the integrity of the bond. If the counsel is concerned with the integrity of the bond, Section 14 is the relevant law. Bell looked at his copy of the documents. She could see from the angle of his head that he was reading something he had read before. He was a procedural man. He would need the procedure to be sound. She had made certain the procedure was sound. Section 14 has never been invoked, he said. That is true, she said. This situation has never occurred before. Laws that address extraordinary situations are not invoked until extraordinary situations arise. The absence of prior application is not an argument against applicability. Hale looked up from his notes. The challenge also contends, he said, that allowing a recognition of this kind would create a precedent that could be misused. That females might deliberately avoid the ceremony in order to claim the Section 14 provision later. Section 14 requires verifiable recognition in front of park witnesses, Sarah said. The Alpha King cannot be compelled to sense what he does not sense. The provision cannot be manufactured. The precedent it sets is simply that the law applies in the circumstances for which it was written. Hale made another note. He had the manner of someone who was persuadable not by argument but by the quality of the argument, the internal logic of it, and she had made certain the internal logic held. Philip Croft had stopped consulting his advisors. He was watching her now, directly, with the assessing look of a man who had been trying to read the room and was now reading her instead. "You are the park records keeper," he said. "Yes," she said. "You found this section yourself?" "Yes." "And you came here today without the alpha at your side," he said. He said it not as a criticism but as an observation he was still evaluating. "The law is the respondent," she said. "I am applying it. The alpha is not on trial here and neither am I. The section is either applicable or it is not. If the council believes it is not applicable, I would ask them to state specifically which clause of Section 14 excludes this situation, because I have read it carefully and I cannot find one." The room was quiet. She waited. She did not feel the quiet. She had spent her whole life being good at quiet, and this was a circumstance in which that was the correct tool. Bell looked at Hale. Hale looked at his notes once more and then put his pen down. Croft looked at the far wall for a moment with the expression of a man arriving at a decision. The High Wolf looked at the three of them in sequence. "Councilman Bell," he said. Bell was quiet for another moment. "Section 14 is applicable to this situation," he said. His voice was even, the voice of a man who followed the law wherever it led, even on mornings when it led somewhere he had not planned to go. "The challenge fails on its stated grounds." The High Wolf wrote something. "Councilman Hale." "The challenge fails," Hale said. "Councilman Croft." Croft looked at Sarah one more time. Then, "The challenge fails." The High Wolf set down his pen. He read the formal dismissal of the challenge in the same even voice he had read the initial filing, and then he closed his folder and looked at her across the room with an expression she had not seen on him before. Not warm, exactly, but less strained. "The proceedings are closed," he said. "The archive will receive the official record within 3 days. "Thank you," she said. She gathered her documents. She did not allow her hands to be anything other than steady. She put the volume back in its protective cover. She aligned her notes. She picked up everything she had brought with her and she walked toward the chamber door with her chin at exactly the angle it had been when she arrived, and she did not run and she did not collapse and she did not cry, though she made a note to do at least one of those things later when she was somewhere appropriate. Caden Holt was in the corridor outside. He had not been in the room, she realized. He had been here, outside the door, for the entire hearing. Standing in the corridor of an old stone building on a Tuesday morning waiting for her to come out of a room she had entered alone. She looked at him. He looked at her. He said nothing. He was very good at knowing when not to say anything. "Bell accepted Section 14, she said. "I heard," he said. "Were you listening at the door?" she said. "The door is not particularly thick," he said. She almost laughed. It surprised her, the almost laugh. It came from somewhere unguarded that was getting harder to keep guarded, and she let it go and it was fine and she was fine and the challenge was dismissed and she was standing in a corridor outside a council chamber she had walked into alone. "I need to get the documents back to the archive," she said. "The record is going to come through in 3 days and I need to have the relevant historical precedent already filed and cross-referenced before it arrives." "Of course," he said. They walked through the park grounds together, which was the first time they had walked anywhere together, and the morning had gone cold in the way autumn mornings go cold around here, sharp and clean, with the smell of the frost that was coming. People saw them. People would always see them now. She understood that the watching had not ended and it was not going to end, and she had spent a long time making herself small enough not to be seen, and it had not worked, and perhaps it was not what she wanted anymore. The archive was dim and familiar and smelled of wax and river water and the particular dry quality of old paper. She set the documents on her desk. She started the organizational process, the log entry, the cross-reference note, the placement in the relevant section. The ordinary work of the archive falling back into its rhythm around her. He sat down at the reading table. Not to read. He sat with his hands loose on the table surface and watched her work with the look of someone who had all the time in the world. She worked for a while. Long enough for the acute edge of the morning to settle. Long enough for the room to feel like itself again. Then she stopped. She stood at her desk and looked across the archive at him. Nina told me to go carefully, she said. But to go. Smart woman, he said. She is, Sarah said. She has always been smarter than she was allowed to be. That is something we are working on. She paused. I am afraid of getting this wrong. I need you to know that. I am not afraid of you. I am afraid of what it would cost me if I stopped being careful and it turned out I was wrong to stop. I know, he said. You keep saying that, she said. Because it keeps being true, he said. She breathed in. Breathed out. She came around from behind her desk and crossed the archive, which was not a large building but felt, in this particular moment, like a significant distance. She sat down across the reading table from him, in the chair closest to where he was sitting, which was not the chair she usually sat in. Tell me something I don't know about you, she said. He was quiet for a moment. Not the deflecting quiet of someone who has nothing to say, but the choosing quiet of someone deciding what to hand over first. I do not like loud rooms, he said. She looked at him. The Alpha King, who stood at the center of every loud room his pack had. That seems inconvenient, she said. Significantly, he said. There was the dry thing again. The almost warmth. Why do you keep coming here, then, she said. To a quiet archive. Because you are here, he said. And then, after a pause, and because it is a quiet room. She looked at him for a long moment. He looked back with that clear, unhurried quality that she had been studying and filing and trying to categorize for 3 weeks and had never quite found the right label for. She thought now that the label was simply honest, which was not a quality she had expected to find in anyone with his amount of authority, and which was the thing that had been dismantling her careful was one cross-reference document at a time. I am going to ask you a question, she said. All right, he said. And I need you to answer it the same way you answer everything, she said. Without making it easier than it is. He nodded. If I let this go where it seems to be going, she said, if I stop filing it away and start treating it as a real thing, will you tell me the truth when it is hard to? Not the comfortable version. The actual version. He did not answer immediately. She did not rush him. The archive held its quiet around them. Yes, he said. And I will ask the same of you. She nodded. She looked at the table and then at the window and then at him. All right, she said. Then I think I would like to know what you were looking at in the Eastern Boundary records for the first 11 days. Something genuinely shifted in his face. Water rights, he said. There is a disputed access point on the Eastern Ridge that has been badly documented for 40 years and I have been trying to resolve it. The Callaway Creek documentation, she said. He looked at her. That creek runs through my family's territory, she said. I cross-referenced it 4 years ago and found 3 conflicting records. I made a note to resolve it and then other things came up. Show me, he said. She stood up. She went to the shelving unit on the east wall. She found the section. She pulled the relevant documents and brought them back to the table and spread them out between them, and they bent over the pages together in the old quiet light of the archive, and outside the autumn morning was getting on with itself, and the frost was coming, and somewhere in the park grounds the ordinary life of the park was continuing in all its ordinary directions, and inside the archive 2 people sat close enough to share warmth from a lamp and argued about water rights in the precise, focused, genuinely interested way of people who had found, without particularly looking for it, the right kind of company. Nina's voice was still in her head. Go carefully. But go. She had gone. The water rights dispute was not resolved that day. It took another 2 weeks, 3 additional documents, and one significant disagreement about the interpretation of a boundary marker note from 70 years ago that they argued about for an afternoon in the focused, undecorated way that was becoming their particular method. The dispute about the marker was eventually settled in her favor, which she noted in the record with a satisfaction she did not bother to hide. She noted it the way she noted everything. Clearly, precisely, dated and signed and filed in the correct section. Some things she did not note in any record. The way the archive felt different now in the hours before he arrived. The way she had stopped pretending she did not know what time it was. The way the quiet that was only hers had gradually become a quiet she was in the process of enlarging, carefully, without losing the things that made it hers. Nina's fire was still in its section. She did not reopen it. She did not need to. She knew what it said. She knew what it did not say. She kept it there as a document of something that had happened, not as a map of something that had to keep happening. Fires were not fate. They were records. The record could stop at any page. Her own story did not have a final page yet. That, she decided, was enough.